Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I would like to welcome you to today's talk with Professor Asher Susser on Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, the two-state imperative. For further information, I'd like for you to see his book on the subject, which is the same title, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, and I think you will find this most helpful. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonnie Ellinger, former faculty member at Bar-Ilan University, who will introduce Professor Susser.
Thank you, Ron. Hello to everybody. Asher Susser is Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University, where he taught for over 35 years. In addition, he was the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University for 12 years, has been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting professor at Cornell, University of Chicago, and Brandeis University, as well as the Stein Family Professor of Modern Israel Studies at the University of Arizona. The author of many scholarly works, his most recent book is on the emergence of the modern Middle East, published in 2017. Professor Susser's online course of that same title has been taken by some 120,000 students, it's a big number, in over 160 countries. I am delighted to welcome Professor Asher Susser to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. Professor Susser.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie, for the very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here again. And today we will speak about Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians, and Israel's options and the two-state solution. So I begin with some introductory remarks. There are three circles of conflict in which Israel has been involved with the neighborhood: Israel and the Arabs, Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and the Jews and Palestinian Arabs in Israel itself. The first circle, the Arab-Israeli conflict, has been over essentially for half a century. When Egypt made its peace with Israel, the Arabs no longer had a military option against Israel. Without Egypt, the Arab states cannot fight Israel effectively. But the conflict with Israel and the Palestinians has not been resolved, as we all know. And the question is, why isn't it over with them? Whereas with much stronger players like the Arab states, we have managed to make our peace. They are much weaker than the Arab neighboring states. And the problem is that as weak as they may be, they are right next door, and there is precious little that we can do to change that. With the Palestinians, if we wish to understand why it is that we have not made it, the conflict between Israel and the Arab states focuses essentially on one main issue: the territories occupied by Israel in the 1967 war, the occupied territories as they were called. And Israel could make its peace with the Arab neighbors if it returned these territories, as it did with Egypt, as it did with Jordan, and it nearly worked even with Syria. With the Palestinians, it's a lot more complicated. It's not just the 1967 issues. It's the 1967 file, as I call it, and more importantly, it's the 1948 file. And the 1948 file only exists between us and the Palestinians. There is no 1948 file between us and Egypt, or between us and Syria or Jordan. And the 1948 file has two parts. One part is about the return of the refugees from 1948 to Israel, what the Palestinians call the right of return. And the other is about the place and the status of the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel itself. Israel defines itself as the nation state of the Jewish people, but 20% of the population are these Palestinian Arabs, who are not Jews, needless to say. So how do they fit in to Israel? And these are two components of the 1948 file that call Israel's existence as the nation state of the Jewish people into question. We can return Sinai to Egypt. We can even return the Golan to Syria. That will not call Israel's existence as the nation state of the Jewish people into question. But returning the refugees to Israel, or redefining Israel as not being the nation state of the Jewish people, will obviously undermine the raison d'etre of the whole Israeli Jewish Zionist enterprise. So it's needless to say, existential, a lot more complicated. And at the moment, it's a problem we cannot yet resolve. We are separated, we the Israelis and the Palestinians, by two historical narratives that are so contradictory, so extremely opposed to each other, that they are unbridgeable at present. We speak of our enterprise. We say from Holocaust to redemption. In Hebrew, we say, Mishoah letkuma. We have, out of the ashes of the Holocaust, created the nation state of the Jewish people, which we see as the epitome of historical justice for the most oppressed of all peoples. It is a great act of self-defense against the horrific fate of the Jewish people in the European diaspora. But from the Palestinian point of view, it's not about self-defense. It's all about aggression. Aggression under the wings of the British Empire, the British mandate in Palestine. If we think that our enterprise is the epitome of historical justice, the Palestinians see it as the epitome of historical injustice. There is nothing in common between these two narratives. They are diametrically opposed. And not only they're diametrically opposed, what makes a Palestinian a Palestinian? What makes Palestinians different to other Arabs? What is the difference between Palestinians and Jordanians, or Palestinians and Syrians or Lebanese? What makes Palestinian Palestinian is their unique historical experience. The traumatic defeat of 1948. That is the core of Palestinianness. This sense of injustice and defeat, the sense of injustice and dispossession, what they call the Nakba, the disaster. So with narratives so extremely opposed to each other, we have never achieved a final agreement with the Palestinians. And I would argue that in the foreseeable circumstances, it's not going to happen anytime soon. The gulf of mistrust has never been bridged. But there are realities on the ground that constantly change, whether we have an agreement or not. And if we look at the demography of all of historical Eretz Israel, the British Mandatory Palestine, if we take all of that territory, that is Israel and the West Bank and Gaza all together, the populations of Jews and Palestinians are more or less equal. About 6.5, 6.7 million each. And that will probably shift in coming years to the advantage of the Palestinians. The Zionist endeavor, the great Zionist revolution, had various assumptions that proved to be very correct, had some assumptions that proved to be incorrect. And two of these shape our reality today. The Zionists believed that when there was an opportunity, the majority of the Jews would come to Eretz Israel. But they didn't. And the Jews of Eastern Europe, who left in their millions in the early part of the 20th century, went in the main to the liberal democratic West. Palestine was a harsh and hard territory those days, not too appealing. And most of the Jews who left Eastern Europe did not come here, but went to America and to other places in the liberal democratic West. And there was another assumption, that the Arabs who opposed the Zionist endeavor and opposed Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine would eventually acquiesce. They will acquiesce because what the Jews of Europe are bringing to Eretz Israel, to Palestine, are the great wonders of European modernity. We will do them good. They will benefit from our presence. And eventually, they will agree to accept us, to embrace us as part of the Middle Eastern family of nations. But that didn't happen either. So the reality was and is that we struggled to maintain a majority, and for very many years never had anything close to a majority. And we do not have peace. Because we couldn't master a majority in the years of the British Mandate, we agreed to partition. And even though we agreed to partition, partition did not mean peace. We agreed to partition in 1947, only to face a war designed to annihilate the entire Zionist project. Fortunately, we emerged victorious, but at great cost, In more recent years, the fear of losing our majority is what drove Israel to withdraw from Gaza unilaterally. Israel withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, knowing full well that this was not about peace. We knew that the rockets would follow. But this was about reverting to partition to keep Israel Jewish. There is no point to the entire exercise if we do not maintain a Jewish majority. And the rockets from Gaza, since the withdrawal in 2005, have become an ever-increasing threat. The rockets have become more lethal, more effective, and calling into question a key component of Israel's military doctrine, which for years and years was, we will not fight the war on our territory. Our territory is too small, too densely populated. We must carry the war to the enemy's territory. And the rockets, we cannot do it. We can react, we can respond in the enemy's territory, but we cannot prevent them entirely from causing damage to our own home front. And Hamas in Gaza is protected by a civilian shield, and they use the tactics of targeting civilians on the Israeli side, creating a reality in which Israel has no great appetite to withdraw from the West Bank the same way it did from Gaza. There was a deal with the Palestinians, with the PLO in 1993, the famous Oslo Accords, but they failed. And in the aftermath of the failure of Oslo, we had the suicide bombers who were a lot worse than the rockets in the number of Israelis killed by the suicide bombers. So why did Oslo fail? We and the Palestinians did work out an agreement. And the agreement even created a kind of political dynamic. After the agreement, institutions were built by the Palestinian Authority inside the West Bank and Gaza. A presidency was elected, a House of Representatives, a parliament was similarly elected, and both these institutions were elected by the people in the West Bank and Gaza, not by the Palestinians in the diaspora, not by the Palestinians in Lebanon or in Jordan. Only the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza elected the president of the Palestinian Authority and the parliament of the Palestinian Authority. Now that is critically important. It reduces the question of Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza. That served Israel. The idea that Palestine was the West Bank and Gaza is something that in theory can be managed by Israel. Israel cannot manage Palestine as all of Palestine. There is precious little we can do with that. But if Palestine is being reduced to the West Bank and Gaza, that is the basis for a political settlement that could be lasting. So we came to the Palestinians, and the Israeli idea was, let's trade off the files. Is the 1948 file, the 1967 file. So we said to the Palestinians, this is the essence of the talks that were held under the auspices of Bill Clinton in the summer of 2000. We will acquiesce in the 67 file being handed over to Palestine. The great majority of the West Bank and Gaza, 90% and more of it, will be the state of Palestine. We will even partition Jerusalem. But the Palestinians, in exchange for our conceding the 1967 file, must concede the 1948 file. We will give 67, you close 1948. No refugee return. And if there is to be refugee return, it should be to the state of Palestine, not to the state of Israel. And we argue, what is the logic of agreeing to the establishment of a Palestinian state if the refugee problem is supposed to be settled in Israel? And it didn't work, because the Palestinian would not acquiesce in the trade-off of 67 for 48. They said 67 and 48, which didn't necessarily mean that all the Palestinian refugees had to go to Israel, but that a significant number of them did have to return to Israel. And Israel couldn't decide how many and who would return. And the Israelis said, we're a sovereign state, we can decide who comes in and who doesn't. The Palestinians said, no, you are the people who kicked out the Palestinians in 1948. Therefore, it's not your decision, it's our decision. And Israel demanded to be able to decide as the sovereign entity who comes in, and the Palestinians demanded that it was their right to decide who had the right of return, not Israel. And so the talks collapsed and have never really been effectively resumed, even though there were attempts here and there, constantly failing on the same thing, on the inability to trade the 67 issues for 48. The incapacity of the Israelis to recognize the extent to which 1948 is this backbone of Palestinianness on which the Palestinians could not really concede. And the status quo, left in place as a result, has its consequences too. The 1967 border that used to be there is history. There is effectively no border between Israel and the West Bank anymore. And as a result, Israel and the West Bank are merging slowly but surely into one political entity. And the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians who are citizens in Israel proper are blending together as one people in a one-state reality. And amongst the Palestinian citizens in Israel, there are two very contradictory trends. There is an increasing desire of Israel's Arab Palestinian citizens to integrate as equals into the Israeli state. There are impressively rising levels of education amongst the Arab citizens of Israel, increasing participation of Arab men and women in the Israeli economy, to the extent that when Israel was at the height of the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, Arab doctors and nurses were in the trenches there with their Jewish counterparts in a ratio equal to their number in the population. 20% of Israel's medical profession at all levels, from nurses to professors, are Israeli Arabs. These days, there is an Arab political party in the ruling coalition in Israeli politics. First time ever. So there is this definite process of gradual integration of the Arab minority in Israel into the Israeli body politic. But this trend of integration is this simultaneously with an increasing nationalistic alienation from the Jewish state. Your independence, they say, is our Nakba. Your independence is our disastrous defeat. Israel passed a new nation-state law in 2018, which emphasizes the nature of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. The law was passed in order to counter this increasing nationalist alienation inside the Israeli Arab population. So the law emphasizes the Jewish character of Israel, but does not emphasize the principle of equality. And this caused great opposition amongst the Arab minority in Israel and in liberal segments of the Israeli society, Jewish society as well. There are serious issues on a day-to-day basis between Jews and Arabs in Israel. Properties, for example, that exist in the mixed cities like Jaffa, Lod, and Acre, not to mention Jerusalem. And these property conflicts are not about real estate, but is part of the nationalist struggle over the future of the country. Typical is the example of Jewish properties that were held in Jerusalem before 1948 and that were taken over by Palestinians after 1948 in the part that became Jordan's Jerusalem. And now the former Jewish owners or people operating on their behalf seek to restore this previously owned Jewish property. That sounds perfectly reasonable, except for the fact that Arabs cannot do that. Arabs who lost property in 1948 are not entitled to retrieve their properties, of which there are many all over Israel. And the Arabs in Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza describe this effort to retake Jewish properties from the past and to evict the Arab residents of the present are described as the second Nakba. The second defeat following 1948, which has exacerbated other issues as well, like clashes in Jerusalem over Temple Mount, manipulated by Hamas in the competition Hamas has with the PLO in Palestinian politics, the religious versus the secular in Palestinian politics, which have resulted in turn in repeated rounds of confrontation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So where do we go from here? What about the long term? What do we aspire to achieve? What can we achieve? First, if we look at Gaza, the problem with Hamas, what is Gaza? Is Gaza 6 brigades of Hamas? Or is Gaza 2 million civilians? Which of these two do you choose to emphasize? Obviously, Gaza is not just 6 brigades of Hamas. It is 2 million civilians living in very difficult circumstances. If we compare Hamas in Gaza with Hezbollah in Lebanon, we fought Hezbollah in 2006. We are now in 2022. We have had nearly 16 years of quiet with Hezbollah. We haven't fought them since then. They haven't taken any serious action against Israel since then, even though they have anything between 100 and 200,000 rockets of different kinds stacked in Lebanon, poised to attack Israel. Between Israel and Hezbollah, there is mutual deterrence based on the fact that we have a lot to lose in a war with Hezbollah. And as much as we have to lose, they have even more. Gaza, on the other hand, there is much less deterrence. Gaza has nothing to lose. If Hezbollah were to take on Israel, the loss to the state of Lebanon would be immeasurable. There would be huge destruction in Lebanon. But the people in Gaza are living on the verge of a humanitarian disaster. There is much less of a sense that they have a lot to lose. True, they have made bad choices. Once Israel withdrew from Gaza, they could have chosen to try and become Singapore. And instead of becoming Singapore, they became a launching pad for rockets against Israel. No doubt, a bad choice. And a choice for which Israel need not give them any prizes. But it is in Israel's own self-interest that they have a life and that they have a lot to lose. Their sewage is our problem. Their sewage ends up on our coastal beaches. If they have a power station, a desalination plant, sewage treatment, a port, Gaza would be a much more livable place. And we have an interest to see that it does become a more livable place, including the opportunity to work in Israel. But to achieve these things is a long shot. It takes two to tango. And Hamas may be willing to continue to sacrifice in Gaza for the sake of their long-term political and ideological goals. But I would still say, with Hamas, without Hamas, Israel should seek some opportunity to resume talks with the Palestinian Authority simply because they are not going to disappear. We have 6.5 million Palestinians as our neighbors, and they are not going anywhere. And it doesn't matter what we do with the Emirates, or we sign a normalization agreement with Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco. The 6.5 Palestinians are still sitting next door. And we have to find some kind of way of dealing with that effectively. But if we resume talks with the Palestinian Authority, considering what it is that we have already discussed this evening, the chances of an agreement are remote. they are almost, I would say, non-existent. But they should also be what I call Plan B. If we try to achieve a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians, and it succeeds beyond expectations, fantastic. But if it doesn't, we must have Plan B. We cannot leave things just as they are. We have to rethink how we control the West Bank. Need we control all of it all the time? What about a gradual withdrawal from parts of the West Bank, spread out over a long period of time, reducing the imprint of the occupation? We have to rethink the issue of Jerusalem. 40%, or perhaps today even a little more, of the population of Jerusalem are Palestinian Arabs. And they have no rights. They are not citizens of Israel. They are not like the Arabs of Israel who have citizenship. They do have certain social rights, social insurance, healthcare. They do have, and they are very grateful for it. But citizens of Israel, they are not, and they are not citizens of anywhere. And that has been the case for 54 years. We have to rethink the situation of the Arabs in Israel. They should be fully integrated into Israeli society as equals. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, and that should never be changed. That is who we are and what we are. But all Israel citizens should be equal before the law and enjoy full social, political, economic equality. Hanging on to it all, suppressing millions of people in the West Bank and Arab Jerusalem, fighting Gaza every few years, and entering into possible violent conflict with the Arab citizens of Israel is not a viable option. The international ramifications of abandoning the two-state idea and abandoning the idea of partition, the international ramifications are serious. Israel was created on the basis of partition. Israel's international legitimacy since day one has been linked to the idea of sharing, of partition. Even if you read the Balfour Declaration, it speaks about the rights of the Palestinians that should not be affected by the creation of a nation home for the Jews. Shifting away from the idea of two states or partition of whatever form is undermining Israel's international legitimacy. The decision after 1967 not to decide what to do with the territories has proven to be awfully wrong. And sooner or later, we're going to have to make decisions on that score. I would say sooner rather than later. Lurking in the background, there is the idea often put forward: Jordan is Palestine. Why not establish the Palestinian state in Jordan? What is all this talk about the West Bank? There are more Palestinians in Jordan than there are in the West Bank. So the argument goes, Jordan was once a part of the British mandate for Palestine. Transjordan, that was established next door to Palestine, was part of the overall British mandate. And as I say, there are more Palestinians in Jordan than there are in the West Bank. So people say, why shouldn't Jordan become a Palestinian state? Well, who is going to make it so? Someone has to transform the state by force from Jordan into Palestine. I don't see exactly who's going to do that. And moreover, I would say, why should Israel do that? Jordan is the only Arab state that has an interest in Israel's existence. Israel and Jordan together contain the Palestinian challenge. This has been so for decades. Transforming Jordan into Palestine, as some would say, without even knowing how that is supposed to be achieved. The Jordanians are not just going to get up and disappear. The Jordanian military is not going to walk away from the battlefield either. The Jordanians are a people as much as the Palestinians are, and they're not about to give up their patrimony either. But assuming that somehow, by some miracle, Israel manages to transform Jordan into Palestine, is this state going to be as friendly to Israel as Jordan has been always? Jordan is the most reliable neighbor Israel has. To replace it by some kind of Palestinian state, probably ruled by Hamas or someone of that nature, why would that be better for Israel? Linked with Iraq and through there to Iran, how is that possibly going to serve Israel's long-term security needs? Israel's whole vision of its security facing the East is based on a stable Jordan. The idea that we undo this stable Jordan is difficult to comprehend. It has no logic, and is not doable in practical terms either. Jordan, over the years, has developed an interest in a Palestinian state. Jordan wants there to be a Palestinian state in the West Bank, precisely for the reason that there are people who say that Jordan should become Palestine. The Jordanians argue Palestine is in Palestine, not in Jordan, and therefore, in order to save Jordan from this argument, they have a vested interest in the creation of a Palestinian state, with which one day they may make a confederation of sorts. But that would require Israel to concede on the idea of some kind of alteration of the reality in the West Bank as it presently is. No normalization with the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain can be a replacement for some serious engagement with the Palestinians at all levels. Israel has been enormously successful in many ways, and it has a great potential to remain so. But that requires courageous decisions by coming to terms with reality. Netanyahu's great achievement of maintaining the status quo with the Palestinians is actually a huge step in the wrong direction. There is a new government in Israel committed to the preservation of the status quo for the meantime. It's a very strange coalition of right and left, and they couldn't possibly engage in a serious initiative with the Palestinians without the government falling apart. But Israel has no choice but to think of how it comes to some kind of recreation of the two-state dynamic, rather than the one-state dynamic in which we are presently situated, gliding down the slippery slope into a one-state reality, where what will become a Jewish minority will be holding the short end of the stick. Thank you, and I welcome any questions, comments, as they may be. Please, go ahead. The floor is yours.
I have one question. Talking about the role of the Jordanians. In 1948, as Israel was declaring independence, and that did not happen in the Palestinian territory. Well, Gaza apparently did, but the Jordanians viewed the West Bank as their territory. They were going to occupy it. And so so what has happened in the meantime that the Jordanians have backed off and now see the need for a state, a Palestinian state?
Well, it's a very good question, and cuts to the core of the Jordanian dilemma. In 1948, the Jordanians indeed wanted to take over as much as they could of Arab Palestine, of what was, according to the partition, to be the Arab state. The Jordanians had no interest then in the creation of a Palestinian state, which they feared would expand at their expense across the river in the other direction. eastwards. And the Jordanians were opposed to a Palestinian state for decades. And this went on after the 1967 war for quite some time. And the Jordanians argued consistently, Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan. That was a Jordanian argument. And the Jordanians made that argument in order to emphasize that there was no need for independent Palestinian representation. Jordan, like Israel, did not want to see independent Palestinian representation. Jordan and Israel together, in the war of 1948, dissolved Palestine. There was no Palestine after the war of 1948. Israel had the great majority, Jordan had the West Bank, and there was this little finger of Gaza occupied by the Egyptian military. Palestine was off the map, didn't exist. But the Palestinians, particularly after 1967, have succeeded in establishing themselves again as an autonomous player in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this is where the Jordanians began to think again. That is, if Jordan is Palestine, and they continue to argue that, they are undermining their own existence on the other side of the river. In order not to do that, Hussein, sometime in the mid-80s, changed the slogan from Jordan is Palestine and Palestine is Jordan to Jordan is Jordan and Palestine is Palestine, and Jordan formally in 1988 gave up the West Bank. Because they felt that if they had so many Palestinian citizens and they had a claim to the West Bank, they were themselves fueling the argument that Jordan should become Palestine. And therefore they changed course completely. The moment Oslo was signed, Hussein rushed to Israel to establish an agreement of his own, to make sure that Israel and the Palestinians were not colluding against him. And that is how the Jordanian position changed to become what it is now, where the Jordanians are the most urgent seekers of a Palestinian state, because they wanted to be clear to all and sundry that the state of Palestine is on the other side of the river and not in Jordan.
We have a question about elections in Israel. And this is, we don't know who's asking this question, but it's who has the right to vote in the elections? And could you speak to that? And could you add about the Arab Party, the Arab Israeli Party?
First of all, in Israel's elections, all Israeli citizens can vote, irrespective of whether they are Jewish or otherwise. What that means is that all Israeli citizens indeed do vote in the elections, but not the Arabs of Jerusalem. The Arabs of Jerusalem do not vote in Israeli elections because they are not citizens of Israel. Israel took over Arab Jerusalem in 1967, but did not grant citizenship. So they do not vote in Israel's elections. They can vote in municipal elections because they are residents of Jerusalem. But they can't vote for the Knesset. They can't vote for parliament. And in the municipal elections, there are very few of them do vote. The great majority of them do not participate in Israeli politics. On the other hand, the Arab citizens of Israel have become more and more involved in Israeli politics, and because their numbers are increasing, they have more and more members in parliament. There are two separate Arab political parties. One is somewhat more conservative and the other more, when I say conservative, is more towards the religious side, and the other more leftist, some partly formerly Marxist. They were, for a time, one party. They're now split into two parties. And the more conservative party is in the ruling coalition of Israeli politics now for the first time ever. You have an Arab party in the government, which is changing Israeli politics in a revolutionary fashion. They have a say. They have a say on every issue. If they walk out of the coalition, the government will fall. The government's existence it depends on the 5 votes of this Arab party in the coalition of 61. 61 out of 120. That is, they got a majority of 1. If this Arab party walks out of the coalition, there is no government. So the Arab Party, although small, they have 5 seats, is nevertheless a party that wields a great deal of influence and is very effective in mobilizing resources from the government on behalf of the Arab minority. I think, Bonnie?
Yeah, Asher, a question. To what extent do the Israeli Arabs who have been in Israel all these years and are citizens and have the vote and education, et cetera,
Yeah.
part of the government, to what extent do they identify with their Palestinian brethren in West Bank, in Gaza?
I think it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, they travel with Israeli passports all over the world, and many of them say that they are proud to be Israelis. They are, generally speaking, good Israeli citizens, hardworking and pay income tax. More than I could say of some of Israel's Jewish citizens. But there definitely is a sense of identification, strong, with their Palestinian brethren on the other side of the line. They're relatives. Many of them are the same families. They marry each other all the time. And there is because the border is open, it's very common for Israeli Arabs to go shopping in the West Bank because it's cheaper. And they don't feel insecure. So there is, it's a combination. On the one hand, a real desire to be part of Israeli society. You cannot do anything in Israel these days, from paying in the supermarket to going to a first-class heart surgeon without engaging with the Arabs of Israel. They're everywhere. And they're fully integrated into the society, into the education system, the universities, etc. But they do not identify with Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Israel has an anthem which is called the Hope, the Hatikva. It's the hope of the Jewish people for sovereignty and statehood of their own. The Arabs in Israel can't possibly identify with an anthem of that nature. There is an Israeli flag, which has a big Star of David in the middle. The Arabs don't identify with that either. So I'm not saying that Israel should change the anthem or change the flag, not at all. That's our anthem, that's our flag, and we are the majority. But we do have to understand that they have their own sentiments, their own national identity, and we have to think about it and pay attention to it and try to acquiesce. Other than in them actually taking subversive activity against the state, which is obviously intolerable, but the great majority of them don't. So it's a complicated, very complicated relationship where there is both integration and sympathy with the neighbors on the other side. For example, if there were to be a massive clash between Israel and Hamas now in Gaza, these 5 Arabs who are presently in the coalition may very well leave the coalition. It would be a test for them that I think would be very difficult for them to face. That Israel is at war with Hamas and they're sitting in the government that's doing that. It would be a tough call.
Okay, thank you.
Hallie Faust asked if you could comment on the negotiations with Barak and Omer and that were rejected by the Palestinians.
Well, first of all, in both cases, Barak and Olmert, and with Olmert a little bit more, there was progress. We did agree to withdraw at one stage when it was both Barak and Olmert agreed to withdraw from over 90% of the West Bank. It was 94, 95, 96%. And the idea was that for the 4 or 5% that remained, Israel would give territory from Israel proper in exchange. So there was more or less a territorial, very close to a territorial agreement. But that's not where the problem was. 2 issues remained. One, the Temple Mount and its environs in Jerusalem. Who has sovereignty over Temple Mount? and the Palestinians would not agree to anything but Palestinian sovereignty, and Israel would not agree. Israel would agree to some kind of international supervision. The Palestinians wouldn't have it. But the big issue was refugees. The Palestinians would not agree to give up on the idea that a significant number, 100, 150,000, even more, Palestinian refugees should return to Israel proper. And even when Palestinians did mention a number like 100 to 150,000, and the number was leaked, they denied that they mentioned any number, and that it was all about the right of return without any limitations. There was no effort on the Palestinian side to try and prepare the population for concessions on the refugee question. And the refugee issue has been the major stumbling block, and I have not seen any change but for the worse over the last 10 years when it comes to dealing with that issue. And I would say that that is what has driven some here to the idea of a unilateral withdrawal from those areas that Israel can afford to withdraw from. Because if you're going to wait until the refugee problem is resolved, we may have to wait forever. And waiting forever is not in Israel's best interest. Whereas for the Palestinians, waiting forever is not a bad deal. Because in the forever, they may have the demographic advantage. So Israel has to think twice about that. And I would go, and that is the logic of the withdrawal from Gaza in the first place. The logic of the withdrawal from Gaza was not that we would withdraw and get peace. Nobody in the decision-making in Israel, when it came to that decision, thought that withdrawing from Gaza would be peace with Hamas. And nobody even dreamt of it. It was all about keeping Israel Jewish, not about peace. And this is where the complication enters Israeli thinking. We think you withdraw, you must get peace. Makes sense. But we withdrew from southern Lebanon, and we didn't get peace from Hezbollah. But for 15 years, we haven't been fighting them. We withdrew from Gaza, the fight hasn't ended. But we don't rule over 2 million Palestinians who are in Gaza. And it goes back to the origins of the origins, the numbers game. And to that great assumption of the Zionists, which didn't materialize. The majority of the Jews didn't come. Even now, you talk about the Jews leaving the Ukraine. Are they going to come to Israel? Are they going to go somewhere else? I have no idea. I hope they come to Israel. I'm not sure they will. And on that score, we can only face our own shortcomings. The Arabs are not going to solve that problem for us.
There are a number of people who ask a question about what could be next. Joy Rosenberg, Steve Edelman. So other than being an apartheid country, what are the possibilities?
Well, if we want to avoid that, which I think we desperately do want to avoid, we must think of ways and means of gradually ending the occupation. And I say gradually because one of the mistakes we did make was withdrawing from Gaza overnight. One day we were there and the next day we weren't. And Hamas took great advantage of that. We can't do the same in the West Bank. But I think we must seriously think of gradually rolling back the occupation. It may take 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. We must recreate the two-state option. Because there are too many in the world who are coming to the conclusion that the occupation cannot be rolled back. It's too advanced. There are too many settlers and too many settlements. We are stuck in a one-state reality. People are even writing books now about the one-state solution. And the one-state solution is anything but a solution. Someone called it the one-state non-solution. And I think that is what it is, the one-state non-solution. Israel will look like Yugoslavia, but worse. We have no need to go there. And it's apartheid or Yugoslavia or this phased unilateral initiative. And I don't think there is anything else. And maybe once we begin this, the Palestinians will join in and we'll have something that will be coordinated. If we had waited for Hezbollah to agree for us to withdraw from Lebanon, we would still be bleeding in southern Lebanon 20 years ago, for more 20 years. We withdrew from there 2000. We don't have Israelis killed in southern Lebanon every day. And we withdrew unilaterally. We just walked out. We got nothing from Hezbollah. Maybe there will be a big clash with Hezbollah in the future, but they also have to think about that. And our options are not great. It's not as if we have the nice choice between good and evil. There are a variety of rather unsavory options. And we have to choose the lesser of all evil. I agree that withdrawing from the West Bank is not a great idea. It's dangerous. But staying there is worse.
We have a comment from Peter Kovac, who was in the U.S. Embassy in Jordan after that. Yes. And
I know him very well. Hi, Peter.
And he's asking about some of the work that you were doing then about the successful engagement between peoples. And he's saying, why hasn't it happened? And can something be done maybe in light of the current Abraham Accords to encourage meaningful people-to-people exchange between Israel and Jordan?
Well, just a few weeks ago, I gave a talk to a group from Morocco and the Emirates here in Israel. So with Morocco and the Emirates, it's working reasonably well. Jordan is difficult. Jordan is difficult. Egypt is also difficult. The Jordanians, many of whom are actually of Palestinian origin, like other Arabs, like Egypt too, find it understandable to come to terms with Israel because Israel is powerful. Peace with Israel is a pragmatic exercise. It's not about ideology. We must make our peace with Israel because continuing the war with Israel is just too expensive. Too expensive in human life, too expensive for the economy. We can't do it anymore. But normalizing with Israel, which is what we want, and what Peter is talking about, is taking it a step further. It's talking about embracing Israel as a legitimate member of the Middle Eastern family of nations. That is a step that many of them are unwilling to take. You are our neighbors. You are our powerful neighbors. We accept that. We make peace with you. We accept that too. But to embrace you as legitimate members of the family of nations, as natural members of our community, is too much. And that we still have to overcome. It will take more time.
Howard Friedman has a question about the feasibility of a Palestinian state. Could it survive and thrive, or his question is, would it become a failed state?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think I don't see any reason why a Palestinian state shouldn't survive the same way Jordan survives, or the same way Gaza survives. Palestinians have one thing in common with the Jordanians, which gives them a slight advantage over some of the other neighbors here, like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Palestinians are almost entirely Sunni Muslim Arabs, no minorities. There is a small Christian minority who are very nationalistic and part of Palestinian society. It is not like Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq that are patchwork minority states, mosaics of minorities, sectarian minorities that are at each other's throats and have been for centuries. That's not the case in Jordan and not the case in Palestine either. Jordan, if you look at Jordan's neighbors, they are far more unstable than Jordan, even though Jordan perhaps had a tougher start. But Jordan is more stable than Iraq, and Jordan is more stable than Syria. No civil war in Jordan, the likes of which Assad has just performed in Syria. The breakup of Lebanon. This is not the case either in Palestine or in Jordan. So I think, and relatively speaking, the Jordanians and the Palestinians are the best educated people in the Arab world. So they have a chance. And I think that they could make a reasonable go of it. More so, as neighbors of Israel, they have an even bigger chance of making. Being neighbors with Israel is a great advantage for them. They can work here and make good money, much better than they make in Gaza or in the West Bank. There are collaborations in business, in high tech between Israelis and Palestinians. I think that they could manage a relatively well-educated population, as I said. They have a fair chance, just as good a chance as I would think another 150 members of the UN who probably have less chances.
Okay. I see that our time is coming toward the end. Let's take one more last question from Rabbi Jones Sachs. The question is that if Israel were to withdraw from the West Bank, again, I think you've commented on what would happen about the right of return question, but what would be done about Jerusalem?
I think in the end, if we go back to the negotiations in 2000 between Barak and Arafat, Clinton, at the end of these negotiations, summarized the points of agreement and disagreement. And these are called the Clinton parameters. In the Clinton parameters, there is an acceptance in principle by both sides on the division of Jerusalem into two parts based on ethnic composition of the various neighborhoods. Arab neighborhoods are Palestine, Jewish neighborhoods are Israel. What remained without agreement in those parameters was Temple Mount, over which there was no agreement. But Temple Mount is only 1.5 square kilometers. It's a very small little piece of territory, but very important, needless to say. But over the rest of Jerusalem, the principle of dividing what is Jewish goes to Israel and what is Arab goes to Palestine was accepted by both sides. So this is not something which is completely off the wall. I would say there is a much greater chance of finding a resolution for the Jerusalem issue than there is for finding a resolution for the refugee issue. Jerusalem is not a 1948 issue. Jerusalem is a 1967 issue. It's not about Israel's creation. It's about Israel's expansion. The refugee question is not about Israel's expansion. The refugee question is about Israel's creation. It is directly diverted straight to Israel's jugular. That we cannot accept. But Jerusalem is a different ballgame. There's a lot of emotional issues about Jerusalem, but when it comes to the practicalities, it's easier to resolve than the refugee question.
Professor Susser, thank you so much for this. And I will mention one more time his book on this issue. If you'd like to read further, this is the source.
Thank you very much.
Bonnie?
Professor Susser, we'd like to thank you for a second wonderful talk, and
Thank you.
we hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for enlightening us. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure for you to be here with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and we appreciate and look forward to further conversations.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. My pleasure. Bye-bye.